So we start off with a quick look at the female reproductive system, specifically the female external genitalia, or the anatomy of the female external genitalia. So the external genitalia consists of the clitoris, the vagina, which acts as the cavity, serving as the receptacle for the penis during intercourse, the labia minora and the labia majora. Minus and majors are just singular forms. And if you remember back to the first lecture we did on reproduction, when we looked at the differentiation of the bipotential external genitalia, the labia minora actually develops from or arises from the same embryonic tissue as the shaft of the penis, and the labia majora arises from the same embryonic tissue as the scrotum. And now we move on to the internal reproductive structures of the female reproductive system. So if we were to follow the path of a sperm that's been deposited in the cavity of the vagina, in order for the sperm to continue into the female reproductive tract or to reach the uterine cavity, the sperm first has to pass through a small or narrow opening in the neck of the uterus. And this opening, which actually protrudes a little bit into the upper part of the vagina, is known as the cervix. Now, after passing through the cervix, the sperm is then faced with the cervical canal. And within this cervical canal, it's lined with mucus glands whose secretions create a barrier between the vagina, so this part over here, and the uterus. And the sperm that's actually made it through the cervical canal then arrive in the lumen of the uterus. So the uterus is this hollow muscular structure. So this entire structure is the uterus. Hollow muscular structure, which is just slightly smaller than the fist of a woman. And it's also the structure in which the fertilized eggs will implant and develop during pregnancy. So if we take a cross-sectional view of the pelvis of a female, we see that the uterus has a very thick wall. And actually, upon a closer look, we see that this thick wall of the uterus is actually composed of 3 layers. So the first layer is this thin outer connective tissue covering. So it surrounds or covers or contains this entire uterus. Second layer is the myometrium. Now, myometrium is this thick middle layer of smooth muscle. And then there's the inner layer, or the endometrium. And this endometrium consists of glandular epithelium. And this glandular epithelium and the thickness of this glandular epithelium changes throughout the various phases of the menstrual cycle, which we'll see when we cover the menstrual cycle later in this lecture. Okay, so if we continue following the pathway of a sperm into the female reproductive system, so now it's already entered through the cervix, it's already gone through the cervical canal, and it's reached the uterine cavity. It can then continue swimming upwards through the uterus and leave the uterine lumen by exiting through these openings, which then lead to the fallopian tubes. Now, these fallopian tubes are about 20 to 25 centimeters in length, and they are about the diameter of a normal drinking straw. Now, at the ends of these fallopian tubes, they branch out into these flared open endings, or these finger-like projections, and these are called fimbriae. And these fimbriae are held closely and are very closely associated with the ovaries. So this is where the ovums or the eggs are released from. So eggs are released into the finger-like projections and then move into the fallopian tubes. Now, these eggs are transported along the fallopian tubes towards the uterus with the aid of fluid movement, which is created by the cilia, which line the fallopian tubes. And if the egg, which is now moving down the fallopian tube, encounters a sperm moving up the fallopian tube, fertilization may occur. So taking a closer look at the ovaries, when we take a cross-section of a single ovary, we see that it's an elliptical structure, and this structure is about 2 to 4 centimeters long, and it has an outer connective tissue layer. So this is the outer connective tissue layer, and then the entire central connective tissue framework, which is known as the stroma. Now, most of the ovary consists of this thick outer cortex, and the outer cortex consists of follicles in various stages of development. So development takes place on this side of the cortex, and decline takes place on the side of the cortex. And that's what makes up the majority of the ovary. Then there's also the small central part of the stroma, the small central medulla, and it's the medulla which contains the nerves and the blood vessels. So looking at the maturation or the development of the ovaries, we start over here with the primary follicles. So the primary oocytes, so remember that females are born with a total number of primary oocytes they will ever have for their entire lifetime. Okay, so these primary oocytes are contained within these primary follicles. And the primary follicle consists of a single layer of granulosa cells, which is separated by a basement membrane from an outer layer of cells known as theca cells. So basically, looking at this, you should be able to correlate the differences between the gamete production within the females and the gamete production in the males. So remember, for males, it happens in the seminiferous tubule, and when we looked at that cross-section of the seminiferous tubule, we could see the different columns of maturing or developing spermatocytes, starting from the germ cells and then ending with the flagellated spermatozoa, which are on the luminal side of the Sertoli cells. Now, when we compare this to the gamete production within the females, so the whole process takes place within the ovaries, and yes, we do start off with less mature oocytes at the level of the primary follicles, but we don't start off with the germ cells, because remember, by the time that females are born, mitosis has completed completely. So mitosis has ceased. That's why we are born with the primary oocytes, and these primary oocytes, as I said, are contained within these primary follicles. And then we have maturation from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle, etc., etc., until the ovulated oocyte. But then another difference comes in between the male and the female gamete production, is that within the gonad of the female, there's also a section devoted to the decline of the follicles.